At 0700 on December 27, 1944, Flight Officer Robert Mitchell sat alone in the cockpit of a Waco CG-4A glider, breath fogging the plexiglass as French ground crews slid wooden crates of high-explosive ammunition into the open cargo bay behind him. The glider creaked softly under the growing weight. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, machine gun belts. 3 tons of ordnance stacked inches from his back. Mitchell was 24 years old. He had logged 15 training flights. He had never flown a combat mission. The CG-4A was not an airplane in any meaningful sense. It had no engine, no armor, no parachute. Its skeleton was fabric-covered steel tubing, its floor plywood bolted together like a shipping crate. Empty, it weighed less than 2 tons. Loaded for today's mission, it would push 9,000 pounds, far more than it was ever meant to carry. Glider pilots had names for machines like this: flying coffins, tow targets, plywood hearses. Mitchell understood why. German 88mm flak batteries ringed Bastogne like iron teeth. Every approach route had been ranged, timed, and rehearsed for a week. Yesterday's resupply attempt had already cost 5 tow planes and 17 gliders. Men burned alive inside wooden fuselages. Others vanished into the Ardennes snow without ever touching the ground. Today would be worse. Mitchell's orders were brutally simple. Ride a 300-foot nylon tow rope behind a C-47 Skitran through a narrow aerial corridor. Descend under fire. Cut loose at 600 feet. Glide, silently, into a landing zone surrounded on 3 sides by German forces. Deliver ammunition to the 101st Airborne Division, trapped inside Bastogne and fighting on borrowed time. 7 days earlier, on December 16th, 200,000 German troops had surged forward in Hitler's final gamble in the West. The Ardennes forest swallowed American divisions whole. Panzer columns advanced faster than Allied intelligence thought possible. By December 20th, the Screaming Eagles of the 101st were encircled in Bastogne, a crossroads town where 7 highways converged and where retreat was not an option. 11,000 paratroopers were surrounded, cut off, freezing, bleeding. General Anthony McAuliffe had answered the German demand for surrender with a single word: nuts. But defiance didn't reload rifles. It didn't refill artillery pits. It didn't replace the division field hospital captured days earlier, along with 42 surgeons and medics. By Christmas, remaining medical teams were operating with kitchen knives and bed sheets. Artillery batteries rationed shells by the dozen. Riflemen counted rounds like coins. Tank crews siphoned fuel from wrecks under fire. For 6 days, the weather grounded Allied aircraft. No drops, no gliders, no relief. Yesterday, December 26th, the skies finally cleared. Mitchell had watched from the operations tent as 11 gliders came in with surgeons and medical supplies. Clean landings. No losses. 40 minutes later, Patton's tanks punched through from the south, and for a moment, everyone believed the siege was broken. It wasn't. The corridor Patton opened was barely 1,000 yards wide. German forces still ringed Bastogne on 3 sides. The 101st could survive, but only if ammunition kept coming. Artillery rounds, mortar shells, rifle cartridges. 3,000 pounds per glider. 50 gliders assigned this morning. All flying into the same killing zone German gunners had been rehearsing for days. The mission briefing had not softened the truth. Enemy flak crews had the approach registered to the second. Every gun within 5 miles, 88s, quad-mounted 20s, was zeroed in. The flight path ran straight over German positions because there was no alternative. Fighter escorts couldn't suppress the flak without hitting the gliders themselves. Tow planes would climb to 6,000 feet, then dive hard to 600 for release. Maximum exposure time, for minutes. From 8 miles out, the glider pilots would be completely alone. There was one other decision, never stated aloud. No co-pilots. A glider packed with high explosives didn't need 2 dead pilots if it took a direct hit. Better to risk 1 trained man than 2. 50 gliders. 50 pilots. Single-seat missions. Mitchell had volunteered for glider training 6 months earlier because it seemed safer than jumping out of airplanes with silk straps and hope. The recruiter hadn't mentioned mornings like this. He checked his watch. 15 minutes to takeoff. 50 gliders waited along the frozen runway, their wings rimed with frost. Every pilot had volunteered. Every man understood the odds. In training, instructors spoke casually of 50% casualties. Yesterday's numbers suggested that estimate might be generous. Mitchell looked through the glider's blunt nose at the ammunition crates behind him. One tracer round through the fuselage, and the aircraft would vaporize. The fabric skin wouldn't stop a rifle bullet, let alone flak. He had written a letter to his mother the night before. Sealed it. Addressed it. Left it on his bunk with his personal effects, just in case. Outside, the tow rope tightened. The C-47 ahead of him began to turn over its engines. The nylon line stretched across 50 feet of frozen runway. In half an hour, Mitchell would either be unloading ammunition in Bastogne or scattered across a Belgian field in pieces small enough to shovel. He wrapped his gloved hand around the control stick. At 0800, the Skitran's engines roared to full power. The rope snapped taut. The glider surged forward. No brakes, no throttle, only momentum and physics. 60 miles per hour. 70. At 85, the CG-4A lifted from the runway, shuddering as Mitchell eased back to match the tow plane's climb. One wrong movement, and the rope would snap. One mistake, and the glider would stall. Either meant death. Behind him, 49 more wooden aircraft clawed into the winter sky. 37 from this field. 13 more from Orleans. 150 tons of ammunition. 50 pilots. The largest glider resupply mission of the war was Airborne, and every man flying it knew exactly how fragile he was. Robert Mitchell had arrived at glider training school in May 1944 because it was the fastest way into the air. The Army Air Forces demanded 2 years of college from powered aircraft pilots. Glider pilots needed only a clean physical, steady nerves, and the ability to survive the course. Mitchell had grown up on an Iowa farm. High school diploma. Strong back. Calloused hands. Good eyesight. The recruiter promised flight status without classrooms or theory-heavy exams. You'll deliver troops and supplies behind enemy lines, he'd said. He hadn't mentioned flying wooden aircraft through flak with 3 tons of explosives inches from your spine. Training lasted 12 weeks. 60% of the candidates washed out. The glider instructors were merciless. Landings were practiced in fields marked with wooden stakes standing in for trees, fences, and buildings. No engines meant no go-arounds. One approach, one chance. Miss it and you crashed. Mitchell watched 2 classmates die during landing practice. One overshot a field and hit a stone wall. The other stalled low and cartwheeled into the ground. Another broke his back and never walked again. Mitchell survived. He earned his silver G-wings and was assigned to the 439th Troop Carrier Group in England. He missed combat at Normandy. His unit wasn't scheduled. He sat out Market Garden, again, not on the list. 6 months passed. He trained, waited, and listened to stories from men who had already flown missions and never flew again. Now, 6 months after pinning on his wings, he was finally heading into combat. The C-47 ahead of him climbed steadily towards 6,000 feet. Mitchell's glider flew 200 feet below and behind it, suspended by nothing but a nylon rope. Formation flying in a glider demanded constant attention. Too high, and the rope would drag the tow plane's tail down. Too low, and lift would bleed away until the glider dropped like a stone. Mitchell kept his eyes locked on his airspeed. 120 miles per hour. Standard tow speed. His hands stayed light on the controls. Small corrections only. The CG-4A wanted to fly straight if you let it. Fight it too hard, and you introduced oscillations that snapped tow ropes and killed crews. Below him, France slid past in winter gray. Villages, bare forests, thin roads dusted with frost. American lines lay 30 miles ahead. German positions another 10 beyond that. Bastogne sat 15 miles deeper still, wrapped in artillery fire and snow. Total flight time, 90 minutes. Time that mattered, the final 10. Mitchell glanced left and right. Dozens of gliders filled the sky, their fabric-covered wings glowing faintly in the winter sun. Each carried enough ammunition to flatten a city block. During the briefing, the pilots had discussed it quietly. If flak hit the cargo bay, the glider wouldn't crash. It would detonate. No pain, no fire, just nothing. Some pilots said that was preferable to burning alive or being captured. Mitchell tried not to imagine either. The weather held clear. Light winds, 28 degrees. Perfect flying conditions and perfect shooting conditions. Yesterday's glider mission had landed late in the afternoon, catching German gunners off balance. Today's resupply was flying in broad daylight. Intelligence estimated the Germans had doubled their flak positions overnight. They knew more gliders were coming. Mitchell checked his watch. 8:30, 1 hour to release. Some pilots filled the time talking to their tow crews over the intercom. Others sat in silence. Mitchell fell into the second group. He had already said everything he needed to say in the letter waiting on his bunk. The formation crossed into Belgium. Enemy territory lay directly beneath them. The gliders tightened spacing. There was no room to maneuver. If a lead aircraft was hit, the gliders behind would fly straight through the debris. The flight plan allowed no evasive action. Straight in, straight through, minimum exposure time. Physics over tactics. Turbulence jolted Mitchell's glider. The wooden frame creaked. Fabric rippled. He corrected gently and felt the aircraft settle. Everything about the CG-4A was built to be expendable. Light materials, simple construction, no critical components worth saving. Furniture factories built them. Refrigerator plants assembled them. $14,000 per aircraft. AP-51 Mustang cost more than 3 times that. The Army did not expect gliders to come back. As the formation neared the front lines, Mitchell saw smoke columns rising from artillery positions below. American guns firing east. In 15 minutes, those same German batteries would be firing back at him. At 9:20, the lead C-47 crossed into German-held territory. Mitchell flew mid-formation, 20 gliders ahead of him, 29 behind. The tow planes held 6,000 feet. The gliders rode just beneath at 5,800. The ground below changed. Fewer villages. More trenches. Zigzagging fortifications carved into frozen fields. This was the Bulge. The first flak bursts appeared 8 miles from Bastogne, black blossoms erupting at altitude. 88mm shells. The Germans were ranging the formation. Mitchell watched the bursts walk closer. The tow planes did not maneuver. They could not. Any deviation risked tangled ropes or mid-air collisions. The only option was to fly directly through the fire. A shell burst 200 feet to Mitchell's left. The blast wave slapped the glider sideways. Shrapnel punched through the fabric near the tail. The control stick shuddered violently. Rudder damage, but still responsive. Mitchell corrected. The glider held. Another burst, closer. Smoke swallowed the cockpit for 3 seconds. When he emerged, the glider ahead of him was trailing gray smoke. Its left wing was shredded. Fabric flapped loose, exposing broken ribs. The pilot fought for control, but the aircraft was losing altitude fast. There was no way he would reach Bastogne. Mitchell watched the glider peel away and sink toward German-held ground. If the ammunition detonated on impact, the pilot would never know it. If it didn't, he would be captured, assuming he survived the landing. More flak. The German gunners had the range now. AC-47 ahead took a direct hit. Its left engine exploded into flame. The pilot held the aircraft level just long enough for the crew to bail out, for parachutes blossoming beneath the burning wing. The glider it had been towing cut loose automatically and pitched into a steep dive. No pilot could recover a glider from a vertical descent. Mitchell kept flying. Straight ahead lay Bastogne. It hit the ground 7 seconds later. The explosion punched upward like a rising sun, orange flame wrapped in black smoke, visible even from 6,000 feet. Mitchell didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. He counted instead. 2 gliders lost. 1 C-47 destroyed. 5 miles still to go. The flak thickened. The Germans were firing everything they had now. The slow, heavy bursts of 88mm guns mixed with the snapping streams of 20mm cannon fire. Red tracers clawed upward through the formation. Somewhere behind him, Mitchell heard metal tearing, fabric ripping, wood splintering. Another glider took a hit. He didn't look back. Looking wouldn't change the math. The C-47 ahead and to his right shuddered as shells walked across its fuselage. Smoke poured from its right engine. The pilot held formation for 30 seconds, long enough for discipline, not long enough for survival. Then the engine seized. The propeller froze mid-spin. A fully loaded C-47 could limp on one engine. A C-47 towing a 9,000-pound glider could not. The tow plane pilot released early, 4 miles from Bastogne. Mitchell watched the glider peel away and begin its solo descent. 4 miles was possible. Maybe. At 60 miles per hour, the glide would take 4 minutes. But altitude bled away at 400 feet per minute. Starting from 5,800 feet, the margin was razor thin. One mistake, one gust, one hit, and the pilot would come down in German territory. A shell burst directly beneath Mitchell's glider. The blast lifted the entire aircraft 20 feet like a tossed leaf. Mitchell slammed forward, then back as gravity reclaimed him. He fought the controls, arms locked, teeth clenched. The nose pitched down violently. He hauled back on the stick until his shoulders screamed. The glider stabilized, but something was wrong. Vibrations crawled through the airframe. Low, uneven, structural. Landing gear, maybe. Wing struts. He wouldn't know until touchdown. 3 miles. The flak was so dense Mitchell could smell cordite through the holes torn in his fuselage. Another glider to his left vanished in a white-hot flash. A direct hit. The ammunition detonated in midair. The shockwave slapped Mitchell's cockpit, heat washing across the canopy. Debris hammered his right wing, punching new tears in the fabric, cracking ribs beneath. 2 miles. The C-47 towing Mitchell began its planned dive. 6,000 feet down to 600. 30-degree angle. The tow rope went slack as the tow plane accelerated downward, then snapped tight again as the glider followed. The maneuver shortened exposure time, but it plunged them straight into the thickest belt of German fire. 1 mile. Bastogne appeared ahead through the smoke. Small, scarred, surrounded. Foxholes and sandbag walls traced a rough oval around the town. German positions pressed in from 3 sides. This was not a city. It was a pocket, and Mitchell was flying straight into its center. The release light on his panel flashed red. Cut loose. Mitchell pulled the release handle. The rope dropped away. His C-47 banked hard left and climbed for daylight. Mitchell was alone. 600 feet of altitude. 1 mile to the landing zone. 60 seconds of flight remaining. The German gunners knew exactly where he was going. The glider fell through 600 feet, powerless, committed. Mitchell aimed for a snow-covered field north of Bastogne. Orange panels marked the landing zone. American soldiers waved frantically, pointing him in. The field looked clear. He knew better. German artillery had pounded this ground for a week. Craters hid beneath snow. Unexploded shells waited just under the surface. Any of it could flip a glider, tear it apart, ignite the cargo. 500 feet. Green tracers arced up from the east. 20-millimeter fire, tracking his descent. Mitchell tried to correct, but the controls felt soft. Damage limited his turn to maybe 30 degrees. Not enough to evade. He held his approach. For 100 feet. A tracer punched clean through his right wing. Fabric shredded. A wooden rib cracked. The glider yawed violently to the right. Mitchell stomped left rudder. It answered, but sluggishly wrong. Structural damage again. He had seconds left. 300 feet. The landing zone rushed toward him. Mitchell could see individual soldiers now. Men running toward the field with stretchers, ammo carts, bare hands. They knew what these gliders carried. 3 tons of ammunition per aircraft. The 101st had been rationing bullets for 6 days. Every crate mattered. Every intact landing meant men could keep fighting. 200 feet. Mitchell flared. The nose rose. Descent slowed, but speed stayed high. Too high. No way to bleed it off. 100 feet. 50. The landing gear slammed into frozen ground at 70 miles per hour. The right wheel collapsed instantly. The strut buckled. The wing dropped and struck the earth, tearing away 8 feet of structure. The fuselage skidded sideways, spinning across the snow. Mitchell clung to the stick as the tail snapped free. The cockpit separated from the cargo bay. Wood, fabric, and metal disintegrated around him. Then, silence. The glider stopped. Mitchell was alive. The ammunition hadn't detonated. He sat stunned in what remained of the cockpit, breath coming in sharp gasps. German positions barely 400 yards away. Soldiers reached him in seconds. A sergeant wrenched open the cockpit door. "Can you move?" Mitchell nodded. He unbuckled, climbed out, legs shaking uncontrollably. The sergeant pointed toward the tree line. "Medics that way. Get checked. We'll unload the cargo." Mitchell looked back. The ammunition crates were intact. Soldiers were already hauling them free, passing boxes hand to hand under fire. More gliders were coming in. From the medic station, a corpsman bandaging a cut on his forehead, Mitchell watched them land. Some touched down clean. Others slammed in like his hat. One overshot the field and shattered against a stone wall. Pilot killed instantly. Another landed in a minefield. Explosions tore the glider apart, scattering ammunition across 100 yards. Soldiers ran into the mines anyway. 3 were wounded retrieving mortar shells. By 9:50, 32 gliders had landed inside the Bastogne perimeter. Mitchell counted them one by one. Each one meant the 101st would fight another day. 32 gliders out of 50. 18 missing. Some had been shot down over German positions. Others had crash-landed short of the perimeter. A few had simply vanished in midair, exploded by flak before anyone could count wreckage or bodies. The exact numbers wouldn't be known until long after the guns fell silent. But 32 mattered. 32 gliders meant 96 tons of ammunition inside the Bastogne perimeter. Artillery crews were already unloading shells by hand, stacking them beside frozen gun pits. Infantry companies tore open crates and redistributed rifle cartridges, passing bandoliers down foxhole lines. Tank destroyer crews finally received fresh rounds for their 76mm guns. The ammunition wouldn't win the battle by itself, but it meant the Screaming Eagles could keep fighting until reinforcements arrived. Mitchell walked through the perimeter. Bastogne looked like a ruin clawed apart by winter and steel. Buildings had collapsed into heaps of brick and timber. Roads were cratered so deeply vehicles moved only at a crawl. Dead German soldiers lay frozen in the streets from earlier attacks, stiff shapes, half buried in snow. American soldiers occupied every defensible inch: foxholes, basements, shattered stone walls. They had been surrounded for 7 days. Their faces were hollow with exhaustion, but their eyes were still sharp. A lieutenant from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment stopped him. "You one of the glider pilots?" Mitchell nodded. The lieutenant took his hand and shook it once, hard. "We were down to 8 rounds per man this morning. You just gave us 50. Mitchell didn't know how to respond. The lieutenant was already moving away with a crate of .30 caliber ammunition, calling orders over his shoulder. The cost of the mission became clear as the morning wore on. 17 gliders shot down. 5 C-47s destroyed. At least 20 pilots killed. A casualty rate of 32%. Higher than D-Day, higher than Market Garden, higher than any previous glider operation in the European theater. The Army Air Forces would later label it one of the deadliest glider missions of the war. But the ammunition had arrived, and that was what mattered. The 101st Airborne would hold Bastogne for another 3 weeks, until the German offensive collapsed. The resupply missions of December 26th and 27th had kept them alive through the most critical 48 hours. Mitchell sat on an ammunition crate near a shattered barn and watched the last gliders come in. He had survived odds that should have killed him, and now he faced a different problem. Glider pilots didn't just deliver cargo. Once they landed, they became infantry. Army doctrine was clear. No aircraft to fly. No way home. You picked up a rifle and joined the fight until you could be evacuated. Mitchell was issued a borrowed M1 Garand and 40 rounds of ammunition. He had fired a rifle during basic training 18 months earlier. Qualified marksman. That was the sum total of his ground combat experience. A captain from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment assigned him to a rifle company holding the northern edge of town. The company had entered the siege with 140 men. They were down to 93, lost to artillery, small arms fire, trench foot, and exhaustion. The company commander looked barely 22. He pointed toward a line of foxholes. "You're with Corporal Hansen. 2-man position. 4-hour shifts. Germans probe the line every night around 0200. Stay alert." Mitchell found Hansen's foxhole 50 yards from the company command post. Hansen was a paratrooper from the 501st, jumped into Normandy on D-Day, jumped into Holland during Market Garden. Now he was dug into frozen Belgian soil, holding a section of perimeter with a glider pilot who had never fought on the ground. Hansen looked Mitchell over once. "You know how to use that rifle?" Mitchell nodded. Hansen didn't look convinced. The foxhole was 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep. 2 men could fit if they stayed low. The bottom was lined with pine branches and a salvaged blanket, insufficient against the cold. Hansen had occupied this hole for 4 days. The temperature was dropping fast. Forecast said 15 degrees Fahrenheit by morning. Mitchell settled in, trying to understand the layout. The company's sector covered 300 yards, 14 foxholes, 28 men, facing what intelligence estimated as 2 German infantry companies across a frozen field. The nearest German position lay 200 yards out. At night, Mitchell could hear them talking. Hansen laid out the rules. No fires. No smoking after dark. No unnecessary movement. The Germans had the perimeter registered for artillery. Any activity brought shells within 5 minutes. Mitchell asked about the glider that had crashed into the minefield. Hansen said the pilot died on impact. 2 soldiers were wounded retrieving ammunition, but they managed to recover 800 pounds of mortar shells before pulling back. That alone had saved the company's mortar section. They'd been down to 12 rounds that morning. Night fell at 1700. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees. Mitchell wore a wool overcoat and gloves, but the cold crept through everything. Hansen showed him how to survive it. Wiggle toes inside boots. Clench fingers. Never let numbness settle. Trench foot could take your toes. Frostbite could take your fingers. Both could kill you as surely as bullets. At 1930, German artillery opened up. 88mm shells walked across the perimeter. The barrage lasted 10 minutes. Mitchell pressed himself into the bottom of the foxhole as explosions tore the ground apart around them. One shell landed 30 yards away. Shrapnel screamed overhead. Hansen didn't move. When the barrage lifted, Hansen checked the line. 1 man wounded in the next foxhole, shrapnel in the leg. He'd live. At 2200, the company rotated foxholes to eat. Cold rations. Crackers. Canned meat. Coffee powder mixed with cold water. Hot coffee would glow on German thermoscopes. Mitchell ate without tasting. You stop noticing after the first week, Hansen said. At midnight on December 28th, German infantry probed the line. Mitchell heard them first. Boots crunching on snow. Equipment clinking softly. Hansen whispered, "Wait for the flare." 60 seconds later, an American mortar fired illumination. The flare burst 300 feet overhead, drifting down on a parachute. White light flooded the field. Mitchell saw them. 15 German soldiers advancing in a skirmish line 200 yards out, moving carefully toward the American positions. Hansen fired first. The rest of the company followed. The Germans dropped to the ground. Mitchell squeezed the trigger for the first time in combat. And Bastogne fought on. Some fired back. Others tried to withdraw. The firefight lasted 3 minutes. When it ended, 4 German soldiers lay motionless in the snow. The rest had melted back into the darkness, dragging their wounded with them. Silence returned, broken only by the faint crackle of frozen ground settling after the gunfire. Hansen reloaded his rifle without looking up. "They'll try again in an hour," he said. "Same thing every night." Mitchell glanced across the field, his breath fogging the air. "Why?" he asked. "Why keep probing like that?" Hansen shrugged. "Because they think we'll break eventually. And they're not wrong." The company had lost 47 men in 7 days. 23 killed, 24 wounded. At that rate, they would be combat ineffective in another week. The glider resupply had brought ammunition, but ammunition didn't replace trained infantrymen. The 101st Airborne was bleeding slowly, 1 foxhole at a time. Mitchell stared into the darkness where the Germans had vanished. Somewhere out there, enemy soldiers were making the same calculations. How long could the Americans hold? When would they run out of men, ammunition, or willpower? And what would happen when one side finally broke? He didn't have answers. He only knew that tomorrow would bring more artillery, more probes, more casualties, and he would still be here, in this frozen foxhole, fighting a battle he had never trained for. Because his glider had landed in Bastogne, and the army needed every man it could get. Mitchell spent 3 days in that foxhole. December 28th, December 29th, December 30th. The pattern Hansen described repeated with mechanical precision. German probes after midnight. Artillery barges at dawn and dusk. Cold rations eaten with numb fingers. Sleep in fragments. Never more than 2 hours at a time. By the 3rd day, Mitchell stopped counting hours. Time blurred into explosions, rifle fire, and frozen dirt. His hands cracked and bled. His ears rang constantly. He stopped noticing the cold unless it suddenly wasn't there. Then he worried about frostbite. On December 30th, the company finally rotated off the line. A fresh unit from the 326th Engineers took over their sector. Mitchell and Hansen walked back through shattered streets toward the assembly area. Mitchell hadn't slept in a bed since landing. The assembly area was the basement of a partially destroyed church. 50 men slept on stone floors, but it was warm. There was hot coffee, real food. Mitchell ate 2 rations back to back and fell asleep sitting against the wall. 6 hours later, a sergeant shook his shoulder. "Captain wants all glider pilots at battalion headquarters. Now." Mitchell walked through Bastogne in daylight for the first time since landing. The town looked worse than he had imagined. Every building damaged. Most streets blocked by rubble. Dead horses frozen where they had fallen. The air smelled of cordite, smoke, and decay. Battalion headquarters occupied a schoolhouse basement. 12 glider pilots were already assembled when Mitchell arrived. He recognized 2 from training. The rest were strangers, men who had survived the same mission by luck or inches. A major from 9th Troop Carrier Command stood at the front of the room. "Gentlemen," he said, "you've done your duty as infantry. Now we need you back." Transport trucks would leave for France at 0600 the next morning. "You'll return to your squadrons." Relief hit Mitchell immediately, followed by guilt. Relief that he was leaving. Guilt that Hansen and the rifle company were staying. The major didn't soften what came next. "The resupply mission on December 27th cost us 17 gliders and 21 pilots. 5 more pilots are missing, presumed captured or killed." He let that sink in. 21 pilots dead out of 50. 42% casualties. Higher than our estimates. Higher than any glider mission in the European theater. No speeches. No praise layered with excuses. "You flew into a meat grinder and delivered the ammunition that kept the 101st fighting," the major said. "General McAuliffe asked me to convey his personal thanks." Dismissed. Mitchell returned to the church basement. Hansen was awake, cleaning his rifle. Mitchell told him about the transport trucks. Hansen nodded. "Figured they'd pull you pilots out eventually. Can't train new glider pilots as fast as infantry replacements." Mitchell asked how long Hansen thought the siege would last. Hansen shrugged. "Patton's corridor is holding. Reinforcements are trickling in. Germans are running out of steam. Maybe another week. Maybe 2. He paused, then added, "You did good work out there. For a pilot." That night, Mitchell couldn't sleep. He thought about the glider pilots who hadn't made it. Flight Officer Gerald Knox, shot down on approach, glider exploded midair. No remains recovered. Lieutenant Wallace Britt, captured after crash landing in German territory. Presumed POW. Captain James Hendris, killed when his glider struck a stone wall on landing. 21 names. 21 volunteers who had flown fabric-covered gliders through concentrated flak. No engines. No parachutes. No second chances. Most of them had died. But the ammunition had gotten through. 96 tons. Enough to keep the 101st Airborne fighting another week. Enough to hold Bastogne until reinforcements arrived. Enough to prevent the Germans from cutting Patton's corridor and re-encircling the town. The mission had succeeded, at a cost of 42% casualties. Mitchell tried to calculate whether it had been worth it. The math worked. But the math didn't account for the telegrams. The empty bunks. The personal effects shipped home. On December 31st, Mitchell boarded a truck convoy heading west. 12 glider pilots. 1 truck. The convoy rolled through Patton's corridor. Mitchell saw the wreckage of the German offensive, destroyed Panther tanks, burned-out vehicles, frozen German soldiers in roadside ditches. The Bulge was collapsing. The Germans were retreating. But it had cost everyone dearly. By nightfall, the convoy reached the airfield in France. Mitchell's squadron had already received replacement gliders, new Waco CG, 4As, fresh fabric, undamaged frames, lined up neatly on the runway, as if nothing had happened. The squadron commander briefed them. Operation Varsity is scheduled for March. Rhine Crossing, biggest airborne operation of the war. We'll need every glider pilot we can get. Mitchell stood at the edge of the runway, looking at the new gliders. They looked exactly like the ones that hadn't come back. And he knew now what it meant when the Army called them expendable. Wooden frames. Fabric skin. Flying coffins. Mitchell had survived Bastogne. 42% of his fellow pilots had not. And now the Army was asking him to do it again. Bigger mission, higher stakes, more gliders, more casualties. He thought about Hansen, still sitting in that foxhole outside Bastogne, fighting every night, waiting for the next probe, the next artillery barrage. Hansen didn't have a choice. He would stay there until the siege ended, or until he was killed or wounded. Mitchell did have a choice. He could request a transfer, ground duty, training assignment, anything that kept him out of a wooden aircraft flying through flak. The paperwork existed. No one would question it. But 21 pilots had died delivering ammunition to soldiers like Hansen. And those soldiers were still fighting, still holding, still bleeding. Mitchell made his decision. He would fly the next mission, and the one after that, for as long as the Army needed glider pilots. Because someone had to fly the wooden planes into hell. And Mitchell was one of the few who had survived to do it again. The story of the Bastogne glider mission spread slowly through 9th Troop Carrier Command. Not through official channels, but through letters, mess hall conversations, pilots who had survived talking quietly to those who hadn't flown. By January 1945, every glider pilot in the European theater knew what had happened on December 27th. Most understood what it meant. The Army Air Forces didn't publicize the mission. No press releases. No newsreel footage. No medal ceremony. Glider pilots occupied a strange place in the military hierarchy. They wore pilot wings, but flew aircraft without engines. They had flight status, but became infantry after landing. The Army treated them as expendable. Cheaper to lose a glider pilot than a bomber crew, faster to train a replacement. But the soldiers who received the ammunition knew better. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne for 3 more weeks after the glider resupply. They repelled 14 major German attacks. They kept the corridor open while reinforcements poured through. By mid-January, the German offensive collapsed completely. The Bulge was eliminated. American forces were advancing east again. In February, General McAuliffe wrote a letter to 9th Troop Carrier Command. Mitchell saw it posted on the squadron bulletin board. The glider pilots who flew into Bastogne on December 26th and 27th demonstrated courage beyond measure. They delivered ammunition when we needed it most. They saved lives. They helped us hold. I will never forget what they did. The letter was signed, filed, and largely ignored by higher command. The casualty reports were finalized in March. December 26th, 11 gliders dispatched, 11 landed successfully, 0 pilot casualties. December 27th, 50 gliders dispatched, 32 landed inside the perimeter, 18 lost en route or shot down. 21 pilots killed, 5 captured, 3 wounded. Combined figures: 34% glider losses, 32% pilot casualties. For comparison, Normandy glider operations, 7% pilot casualties. Market Garden, 9%. Bastogne, 32%. The deadliest glider mission of the war to that point. 1 out of every 3 pilots didn't come back. Mitchell learned the fates of individual pilots gradually. Flight Officer Gerald Knox, killed instantly when his glider exploded from a direct flak hit. No remains recovered. Lieutenant Wallace Britt, captured after crash landing short of Bastogne. For months as a prisoner of war. Captain James Hendress, died on impact striking a stone wall. First Lieutenant Charles Morrison, lost his left eye to shrapnel, survived. The medical team that landed on December 26th had their own legacy. Dr. Lamar Sutter and 4 surgeons operated continuously for 72 hours, 87 surgeries, saving an estimated 60 soldiers who would have died without immediate intervention. Sutter received the Silver Star. The citation mentioned courage. It did not mention that he had volunteered to fly into a besieged town in a wooden glider with no guarantee of surviving the landing. Mitchell stayed with the squadron through the winter. New pilots arrived to replace the dead. Fresh faces. No combat experience. Mitchell watched them train, watched them practice landings, watched them load gliders with cargo. He knew what they didn't. That training meant nothing once flak started bursting around your aircraft. That no amount of practice prepared you for flying through a curtain of 88mm shells. That some of them would die on their first mission. By March, the squadron was preparing for another operation. Operation Varsity. Rhine Crossing. Largest airborne operation of the war. Intelligence predicted heavy casualties. Mitchell volunteered. So did most of the Bastogne survivors. Not because they wanted to fly into flak again, but because someone had to. And they knew what to expect. The night before Varsity, Mitchell thought about Bastogne. About Hansen, still fighting in some foxhole somewhere. About the 21 pilots who hadn't made it back. About the ammunition crates he delivered that kept soldiers alive one more day. The math was simple. 21 pilots dead. Thousands of soldiers saved. The mission had worked. At a terrible cost. But it had worked. Mitchell wrote another letter to his mother, sealed it, and left it with his personal effects. Operation Varsity launched on March 24, 1945. Mitchell flew in the second wave. His glider carried a jeep and 4 soldiers. The landing zone lay 3 miles east of the Rhine. German flak was heavier than Bastogne. The sky filled with black bursts. His tow plane took hits but kept flying. They reached the release point. Mitchell cut loose. He descended through the flak, landed hard in a plowed field. The jeep broke free on impact. 1 soldier was killed. 3 survived. Mitchell became infantry again. The battle lasted 8 hours. By evening, the bridgehead was secure. Allied forces poured across the Rhine. Mitchell survived. 38% of the glider pilots did not. Wooden aircraft. No engines. No parachutes. That was the job. Mitchell had survived twice. History would decide whether there would be a third time. Casualties higher than Bastogne. Higher than any glider mission in history. But the bridgehead held. The war in Europe had 2 months left. Mitchell returned to his squadron in April. Germany surrendered in May. In 6 months of combat service, he had flown 2 glider missions, Bastogne and Varsity, both into concentrated flak, both in wooden aircraft with no engines and no parachutes. Both times, the statistics said he should not have survived. He did. He went home to Iowa in June. The Army discharged him with an air medal and a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Nightmares that never entirely faded. He slept lightly. Loud noises made him flinch. For 50 years, black bursts in a winter sky followed him into waking hours. The glider program ended quietly. In 1948, the Army abandoned the concept entirely. The CG-4A was declared obsolete. Thousands of airframes were scrapped. Some were burned. Others were buried. Furniture factories that had built them returned to making tables and refrigerators. Of the 13,900 gliders produced during the war, fewer than 50 survived into the 1950s. The pilots scattered. They became farmers, mechanics, teachers, clerks. Most never talked about what they had done. When they did, people didn't believe them. Wooden airplanes. No engines. No parachutes. Flying into anti-aircraft fire. It sounded impossible, but it had happened. And the men who did it carried the memories alone. Mitchell died in 2003 at the age of 83. Heart failure. His obituary mentioned that he had served in World War II. It did not mention Bastogne. It did not mention the glider missions. It did not mention the 21 pilots who died flying wooden aircraft through German flak to deliver ammunition to surrounded soldiers. The newspaper didn't know. Mitchell had never told anyone outside his family. But the mission had mattered. On December 27, 1944, 61 gliders were dispatched toward German lines. 32 landed inside the perimeter. 96 tons of ammunition reached the 101st Airborne. Enough to hold. Enough to fight. Enough to keep the corridor open. Because of that ammunition, the 101st repelled repeated German attacks. Bastogne did not fall. Hitler's last offensive failed. Thousands of American soldiers survived because glider pilots flew into hell to bring them bullets. Today, a few CG-4A gliders remain in museums. One at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio. Another at the Airborne and Special Operations Museum in North Carolina. The Silent Wings Museum in Texas preserves the story of the glider pilots. Visitors can see the wooden frames, the fabric skin, the simple controls. They can try to imagine what it took to fly these aircraft into combat. In Bastogne, a small exhibit remembers the resupply missions. A few photographs. Ammunition crates. A fragment of torn fabric from a crashed glider. The text says glider pilots delivered critical supplies during the siege. It does not list the names of the 21 pilots who died. Those names exist only in military records and family memories. The glider pilots who flew into Bastogne were volunteers. They understood the risks. They flew anyway, not for medals, not for recognition. They flew because soldiers on the ground needed ammunition. And because someone had to deliver it.